Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Korea Society. Welcome to this sparkling new facility here at 350 Madison. We're delighted to have you. Be New York City. We will be joined by others over the course of the next few minutes as they run late, but we're very appreciative of your being here on time to welcome Blaine Harden. This on the 3rd of October, the release of what really is quite an important new work, and that is King of Spies. I teach up at Columbia University and teach classes in Korean politics and foreign policy, as well as the international relations of Northeast Asia for graduate students and professional students from diplomacy and the military. And let me tell you, this has already made it onto our required reading list for the spring. It is an absolutely mesmerizing book. It is an important book for those interested in U.S. policy and the Korean Peninsula. It has amazing resonance relative to the rising tensions that we feel today and which meet you with every broadcast. And the book is important in terms of looking at questions of U.S. policy and looking at our contributions, and frankly, thanks to Blaine, really a fair exposition of our failings at different points as well. And what better way to do that, and really a more arresting way to do that, than looking at one really phenomenal, tremendous, and troubled individual. And Blaine will explain what happens with Nicholls of Korea. Blaine will guide us through in a really very nice presentation via slides of how he constructed this and how he built off of the two novels that he worked on and which have gained so much attention, both Escape from Camp 14, which he premiered with us here at the Korea Society and our other location, as well as The Great Leader and His Fighter Pilot. All three of these books, King of Spies, Great Leader and the Fighter Pilot, and Escape from Camp 14, are available at the Frontier for purchase. I would hasten to add that we also have a streaming audience, and with a program like this, we will see upwards of 10,000 downloads of our audio podcast and full video views. So this will go out very widely in terms of our electronic dissemination. And so to that, I thank Peter Stemke, who works very hard on both our audio and our video. But the electronic reach is tremendous. And you're the first audience I've been able to note this to. We have now just reached 1 million audio podcast downloads. And we don't count partial downloads. Those are full downloads. So thank you to all of those who may be streaming online or who may be accessing via video or audio. Blaine is an incredibly important individual. He was a journalist of tremendous distinction. He is a writer of unique clarity. He has a voice that is unique. He is able to put together, to package, and to propel a narrative in the way that few modern authors are. In our courses at Columbia, I use a text called The Two Koreas by Don Oberdorfer and Bob Carlin. And Don was with the Washington Post and did such a tremendous job with that work. Frankly, as I told somebody yesterday, there has been no writer who has made as substantive a contribution in understanding modern Korea in all its complexities and the U.S. foreign policy dynamic than Blaine Harden. And Blaine's work, whether it be on the Pacific Northwest or whether it be now 3 novels on Korea that are incredibly important and that really speak to much, much greater issues. Really, it constitutes already a legacy. So Blaine, thank you for coming back to the Korea Society, and we look forward to your guiding us through. Just to give you an idea of the course of the next hour, Blaine will present his slides. We'll have an opportunity for some Q&A. Hopefully, if you're interested, Blaine, feel free to share a few passages by way of reading if you're comfortable with that. And then we will move at about 6:45, 6:50 into our galley here, where we have a nice reception for you and for Blaine, and then into the gallery where we hope that you can continue the discussion. And as I mentioned, books are on sale, and Blaine has kindly agreed to sign here for you. So do take away a tremendously important book, that being King of Spies. Blaine Harden, welcome, and thanks for joining us for our 60th anniversary season.
Thank you. Let me get the, make sure I can move my slides. All right, great. I think I'll stand here. So Stephen has introduced this book a little bit, and I'll just sort of tell you where I found the book. I'm a newspaper reporter by trade. I report, and also people give me tips. And the tipster for this book, I would have not done it otherwise, was a North Korean fighter pilot. This guy, No Kum Suk. He got in a MiG in September 1953, about 2 months after the end of the Korean War, and flew it. He ran away from his great leader and flew it to South Korea, to Seoul, airport near Seoul, Gimpo. And he jumped out of his plane, offered the plane to the Americans, and he said, "Take me to your leader," in Korean. And the person they took him to was Donald Nicholls, the subject of this book. This was the aircraft that he landed. And the Americans were very keen on getting one of these because it had tormented the Americans during the Korean War, and they'd never had their hands on a battle-ready one before. And it was a very big story. At the time, this is a banner headline in the Washington Post, the day he landed, because of the time difference between Korea and the United States. They had time to put this together. And this was more or less typical of every newspaper on the planet, except for in Moscow and Pyongyang, where they buried the story, and in China. He delivered a tremendous amount of information about Russian involvement in the air war in Korea, which actually changed American intelligence understanding of what the Russians and the Chinese were up to in a war that had killed 33,000 Americans. So he was young at the time when he landed. He got out of the plane. He was 21 years old, but he's now in his mid-80s. And he called me on the phone from Daytona Beach, where a lot of pilots go to retire, including North Koreans who escaped to the United States. And he started telling me the story about his life, and we ended up working on a book and doing this book. And in the course of the conversation, he told me about Donald Nicholls, the guy who debriefed him when he landed. Donald Nicholls opened the refrigerator in his barracks. It contained nothing but Coca-Cola. And he offered a Coke to the pilot, and the pilot took the Coke, and he loved it. He later bought stock and became rich on that stock. That's a side story. Donald Nicholls was very much unlike spies that we think of from Le Carré or James Bond. He was a big guy, 260 pounds, about 6'2". He drank up to a case of Coke a day, a couple boxes of Butterfingers, Hershey's if he could find them. He was just an extraordinary presence in the life of the Koreans that who surrounded him. And he was in Korea for 11 years. And as the Korean War unfolded, and as I found out in the research for this book, he was a phenomenon in the war, a completely unknown and hidden phenomenon from the press. His name never appeared in the New York Times, never appeared in the Washington Post or any English language publication that I could find in my research. But in the secret documents that were sent back to Washington about his performance during the war, the top generals in the U.S. Air Force described him as you see here. At the same time, he remained unknown at home. And the Air Force, as you'll see as I continue this talk, they made sure that he remained unknown at home. He was the guy you want at wartime, and you lock him up afterwards. So when Nicholls, whose name is now Kenneth Rowe, told me about this spy, I was curious. I'd never heard of him. I talked to some Korean War experts, military people who had never heard of him. And then I started digging. And in the process of the research over 3 years, I got his military service record and records in College Park, Maryland from the National Archives and from the Air Force Archives. I found his relatives in the United States. I found the people that he'd served with in the United States, all of whom were in their 80s. I found people that he'd fought with in the South Korean intelligence services and for the South Korean Air Force in Seoul and around Seoul. And I found documents in the Sigmund Rhee archives at Yonsei University, in which it showed that Nicholls would have meetings with the president of South Korea. Sometimes he would meet with the president of South Korea for an hour and a half, and this was in between meetings that the president would have with his foreign minister and his defense minister. Nicholls was, at the time, either a sergeant, a captain, or a major. He was an absolute nobody, and yet he was meeting for hours at a time with the president of South Korea. Nicholls invented the South Korean Air Force. He recommended that Sigmund Rhee establish an Air Force, and he did so despite specific American policy not to have South Korea have an Air Force, because the Americans felt they had no need for it, they couldn't manage it, but it happened because Donald Nicholls pushed for it, and then he was the primary advisor, and he actually named one of his friends, a South Korean general, to become the first head of the Air Force, South Korean Air Force. And this is a guy with a 7th grade education. So what does Nicholls' reign mean for understanding what's going on now with Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un exchanging strange insults with each other? I think as this talk unfolds, you'll get a sense of there's a lot of shadows in American involvement in Korea, particularly at the beginning, that have been ignored or not paid attention to by the United States, certainly by the American public now. So Nicholls was born in Hackensack, not far from here. He was the youngest of 4 children, and he was born into an operatically dysfunctional family. His mother, Myra, was not happy in her marriage. And after her final son was born, she began entertaining men not her husband in the living room of her house as her boys were in the room. She also bathed naked in the kitchen sink. So she behaved in a way that scarred her boys, particularly Donald Nicholls, who was the youngest. And he was 4, 5, 6 at the time when his mother was carrying on like that. And she carried on when her husband, Walter, the thin, pained-looking man, was out delivering the mail. He was a postman. And finally, she just left the family altogether. And this was in the early 1930s. And so Walter took his 4 boys to South Florida. They had no money. Walter was brokenhearted that his wife had left him. He was also angry, and he, on several occasions, threatened to kill himself, but only after cutting the throats of all 4 of his boys. So Nicholls grew up it wasn't a happy American home. When he was 17, he joined the Army, and he joined the Army to get away from poverty, mostly. He, between the ages of dropping out of 7th grade and joining the Army, he spent a good part of his time burglarizing his neighbors, shoveling chicken manure, and doing various odd jobs to raise money to put food on his father's table. So he was happy to go to war, and he went, joined in 1940, and then war started not long after, and he was a carburetor repairman in Karachi, and was quickly promoted to master sergeant, which was very unusual for such a young man. He was one of the youngest master sergeants in the entire U.S. Army, and this is when the U.S. Army had millions of soldiers. But one of the reasons he got promoted is that he figured out how to rig the paperwork at the port in Karachi so that he could get large numbers of crates of supplies for his unit, food, parts, liquor, whatever they wanted. He was sort of a Radar O'Reilly kind of guy. And he was rewarded with this promotion to master sergeant. And he also sort of learned that if you can deliver what your officers want, they won't ask you any questions about how you do it. And that's a lesson that came in very handy in Korea, as you'll see. So after the war, he came home very briefly, re-enlisted, and then went back to the Far East. He went to Guam. And when he was there, he was recruited into the counterintelligence corps, the Army counterintelligence corps. Had 6 weeks of schooling, which was really the most intense schoolwork of his entire life. And then he reported in 1946 to Korea. Korea at the time was just beginning a very violent, very messy, very mysterious civil war as far as the Americans were concerned. That civil war would cost the lives of tens of thousands of people in South Korea. The fight was mainly between poor Koreans who wanted property reform and other socialistic kind of reforms from their government, and the government of Syngman Rhee, which was supported by the United States and was a more traditional capitalistic system where property owners pulled the shots or controlled all the shots. Nicholls became a friend of Syngman Rhee. It's one of the most interesting and maybe unique relationships between an American spy and a foreign president in the history of the American military, if not of American intelligence altogether. Syngman Rhee was 70 when they met, and Nicholls was 23. But they found favor in each other's eyes, oddly enough. Syngman Rhee at that time was a Princeton PhD. He'd gone to Harvard. He'd gone to George Washington University. He was probably the most educated Korean on the planet, and he fancied himself as the most important Korean. Nicholls found him. I don't know when they met, but I know they met sometime in the summer of 1946. And what they ended up doing for each other over the next 11 years was giving each other information and power. By being able to talk to Syngman Rhee, this 23-year-old, young, naive American intelligence officer, could tell his bosses that he had access that nobody else had in the country. And it was true. And what Syngman Rhee could do is he could feed intelligence reports and other policy documents to Nicholls, and Nicholls would pass them on to policymakers and mostly to intelligence officials in Tokyo. So Syngman Rhee could get his message out. And the message he wanted to get out was that North Korea was going to invade the South and that he needed more guns from the United States to prevent this from happening. He needed more tanks, he needed more airplanes, he needed more artillery, he needed more American soldiers, all of which were denied him. The Americans came in 1946 with more than 60,000 troops, but by 1949, they'd pulled them all out. All of the heavy guns, virtually all of the important aircraft were gone. And there were about 500 American military people left in the country. It was a group called KMAG. And the acronym stood for Korean Military in Korea. I can't remember what advisory group. But what I do remember is what people said that the acronym stood for as they began to understand the dimensions of the North Korean threat. And that was Kiss My Ass Goodbye. Nicholls and Rhee were not only close friends, they saw each other often. Friends is probably the wrong word. They saw each other often and used each other. But one thing that Nicholls did that was incredibly shrewd for his career and for his advancement when the war broke out, was that he told everybody that in his chain of command, and everybody who is a senior intelligence or military official in the South Korean government, that Syngman Rhee was his father and that he was his son. So in that hierarchical society that is South Korea, the fact that he could claim to be an intimate of the president of South Korea gave him status and access and influence that was extraordinary. At the same time, the American military machine, if you want to call it that, in South Korea had dwindled down to about 500 people. No one wanted to be in Korea. They thought of it as a place for losers, people whose military career was simply at a dead end. Nicholls was the exception. He learned some Korean, and so he was sort of in the catbird seat when the drums of war started to pound. Because Syngman Rhee was giving him so much information, so many reports about what what was going on north of the border, with the Russians bringing in weapons to Kim Il-sung, Nicholls started writing reports, incredibly detailed and often eloquent, prophetic and really accurate reports about the war that was going to come soon. One of those reports, famously in that no one ever heard about it until I found out about it, was written in February of 1950, but it found its way to the Joint Chiefs in Washington and to the State Department. It said that war is inevitable. The Americans are not going to be able to handle it. And the Pentagon and the State Department wanted to know if it was true. So they asked the military intelligence headquarters, they asked MacArthur's headquarters in Tokyo if this was true. Are the North Koreans coming? MacArthur was the Grand Poobah then and doing a very good job of actually integrating Japan into a post-war world. He was focused on Japan. He saw Korea as a waste of his resources and his time, and he paid virtually no attention to it. He allowed all of the intelligence judgments to be made by General Charles Willoughby, the man on the right. At this time, MacArthur was entering his 8th decade of magnificence as a general, and he was a man who did not like to hear what he didn't already know, including intelligence from Korea saying that a North Korean attack was imminent. His aide, Charles Willoughby, knew that. And Willoughby was many things, including a first-rank lickspittle, and he was expert at giving MacArthur a bath in his own preconceptions. And he never told MacArthur that all these reports were coming in from Nicholls and from others about a possible invasion. In fact, Willoughby wrote assessments, sort of the major intelligence assessments for the spring of 1950, says, I believe war will not happen. Then he heard that Donald Nicholls had written this memo that had gotten people to jump up and down in the Pentagon and at the State Department that spring. And so his natural reaction to that was to try to get rid of Nicholls. I found a paper trail of his attempt to have Nicholls fired and transferred out of South Korea. And I also found a letter from the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to South Korea, in response to that effort from MacArthur and the intelligence chief. And the letter, which I found and no one had seen, no historian had seen it, just told Willoughby, to buzz off, and Nicholls stayed. Willoughby, after the invasion, which would happen in June of 1950, he soon lost his job and spent the rest of his life sort of trying to explain his failures of intelligence in Korea vis-a-vis the North Korean invasion and the Chinese incursion that occurred in the fall of 1950. So during this period when Nicholls was providing these incredibly accurate intelligence reports that everybody ignored, he was also descending into the Civil War world, this sort of demi-mode of mass killings, torture, and beheadings that was part of the Civil War as conducted by Syngman Rhee and his henchmen against South Korean civilians who were suspected of being communists. Nicholls was there. He trained the police. He had jerry cans of severed heads delivered to his office, and he was in attendance at mass killings. In this photograph, he's photographing an execution. This is one of his pictures of that execution. It was in the National Archives. If you look at this picture, you look down near the feet at the bottom, you'll see a head in a bucket. This is on the roof of the South Korean Army headquarters in Seoul. Those are Americans with Donald Nicholls. He's the person to the far left of the picture, looking down at the head, I guess. But he wrote in a memoir that he often had these kinds of heads in jerry cans in his office, and they were sent as proof of progress in the Civil War. Nicholls, when the war broke out, the killing accelerated as the Rhee government found the invasion as an opportunity to get rid of people who were suspect. In Daejeon, just a week or two after the invasion from North Korea, all of the suspected South Koreans who were thought to possibly be willing to sympathize with the North Korean invasion were rounded up, shot in the back of the head, and buried in shallow ditches. I found a letter from Nicholls saying that he was present at this killing. He never wrote a report about it, and he actually lied about his presence there all his life. This is another picture of that killing. These are also in the National Archives. The US government had these pictures, and they had reports from other intelligence officials who were on the scene at the time. They put those in their files and buried them for 40 years. And the US and South Korea blamed those killings on North Koreans. And that's still in the official US Army history of the war. And Nicholls knew it not to be true. I have eyewitnesses who talked to him after he went to the killing, and I have letters that he wrote, handwritten letters about his description of what he saw. And the reason why he was mute on this subject was because of his close friendship with Syngman Rhee. If he had written a report, if he had moved things up the channel of command, up the chain of command, he probably would have lost his access. He would have lost his power, and his career would have been sidetracked. He made that decision. So when the war broke out, Nicholls was both a dark figure and an incredibly heroic figure. He won more than 21 American medals, including the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star. Those are his medals. And those are the number 2 and 3 most important and most difficult to get medals for valor awarded by the U.S. military. He won the Silver Star for finding a T-34 tank and figuring out how to stop it using napalm. and he won the Distinguished Service Cross for finding a wrecked MiG and helping to get technical information about how that plane worked and get it back to the United States so that the Americans could design a better fighter to compete with the MiG in the air war. It was the first all-jet air war in American history, and Nicholls got that information. What's interesting about both of these medals is they appear to have been faked, in the sense that he wrote the reports that gave him the medals himself. And I talked to a man who eventually became the head of the Korean CIA, the equivalent of the CIA, who was with Nicholls for the tank mission and for the MiG mission. Nicholls was not on the ground for either mission, or he was not in the vicinity of the finding of the tank or the MiG. He was at a safe distance, but he wrote reports, incredibly dramatic reports about carrying bleeding bodies away from the tank and then carrying the fuselage of the downed plane over to another plane to load it up. He didn't do any of it, and it was the way it worked in those days. If you were in the right position, you wrote the report and you got the medal. But one thing, and this is the most important thing that Nicholls actually did in the war, and it was crucial to the Americans not losing the Korean War. In the first 2 months of the war, the Americans and the South Koreans were just bullied and routed with lots of death, lots of confusion, and lots of agony on the part of the United States government about what to do. They were pushed all the way down to the southern tip of the Korean Peninsula to a place called the Pusan Perimeter. And there they were surrounded on two sides by the North Korean army with its tanks. And the North Korean army probably should have pushed the Americans off the Korean Peninsula. They had the numbers to do it. But Nicholls had recruited a team of North Korean code breakers before the war. He had them with him down there in the Pusan perimeter, and they started to break the battle codes, because they had code books of the North Koreans, and they got usually 28 to 48 hours advance warning on any big incursion into the perimeter. And so General Walker could bring forces to bear to where he knew they were going to come. There could be no sneak attacks because they had the codes. They knew everything. And they managed to survive long enough for MacArthur to organize a pincer maneuver at Incheon, cut the North Korean military in half, and quite soon destroy the North Korean army. Nicholls was very important in that and never got any credit, and actually never mentioned it in anything that I've ever read about his own career, which was odd, because he was a braggart. So as the war went along, and Nicholls proved that he was, the best intelligence operator in the Far East, his generals started to give him really a lot of hardware, money, power, and men. He had a secret army. He had a secret base. He had his own rules for operating all of it. And he reported only to a General Early Partridge, who ran the 5th Air Force, which was the Air Force that was bombing the Korean Peninsula. He never reported to any colonel or major, or when he was a sergeant to a captain. He reported only to a general, which was unique in the Korean War. And he recruited this army of spies, sent them north. Almost all of them never came back. It was a really, really cruel operation. The CIA was doing the same thing, and they have acknowledged in the past couple of years that they wasted massive amounts of Korean life on attempts to find intelligence in North Korea. The Air Force, according to Nicholls, and according to some of the other letters I've read from General Partridge, did give Nicholls a license to kill. And he acknowledged it, he misused it. From talking to his colleagues, South Korean and American, he threw people out of airplanes into the Han River. He dropped them without parachutes over North Korea. He pushed them out of planes in the Yellow Sea, and without consequence. Early on in the war, South Koreans who were recruited for airdrops over North Korea, knowing that their chances of survival were next to nothing, they attacked him in his quarters at night, and he had a shootout with them. And he shot several. It never appeared in his military service record, the shootout in his own quarters at night. He had an almost complete license to do what he wanted. As the war shifted from a war of armies in the field, moving, sort of rolling all the way south and then all the way north to the Yalu, and then being pushed back by the Chinese army back to the 38th parallel, the war then settled for most of the time of the Korean War into a stalemate. And that was the time where Nicholls really prospered. He developed an empire, a small empire of island bases on both sides of Korea, where he had more than 30 bases, and from them he put his agents into North Korea to look for targets. The targets that they gave him proved to be the targeting for most of the bombs dropped on North Korea. And the bombing of North Korea is a very interesting subject right now, given North Korea's behavior. What's the motivation for North Korea to be so angry at the United States? There are many reasons, and part of it has to do with the peculiar pathologies of the Kim family regime. But some of it's based on history. And this history is really interesting. Nicholls found, according to the U.S. Air Force, 80% of the targets in North Korea. They were bombed long and leisurely by the Americans in these big B-29s. We had lots of pilots and lots of aircrafts, lots of bombs, and lots of napalm left over from World War II. And once the American war machine got organized in Korea, the bombing of North Korea happened almost on a daily basis for 3 years. And it was a savage business. Many cities looked like this. American post-war analysis of what happened is blunt. Curtis LeMay said we killed 20% of the civilian population of that country, of North Korea. And Dean Rusk, we blew up every brick in the country. That may be an overstatement, but the Soviet post-war assessment found more than 85% of the cities were fundamentally destroyed. So if they had done to us in 1950, with our population in 1950, what we did to them, 30 million Americans would have been killed. So that's the scale of what happened in North Korea, because just because of the U.S. Air Force. And the Kim regime has picked up on this fact, and because people are isolated, and because for many in North Korea it's as if the Korean War ended last Thursday, reminding a captive population of the brutality in the Korean War by the Americans is a very effective way to justify endless repression. It also justifies massive spending on nuclear technology and long-range missiles. And it gives you a sense of some of the reasons why this face-off with North Korea endures 7 decades after the war. So when the war ended, Nicholls did not go home. He was that unusual spy who was there before a war, during a war, and then after a war. He continued to walk in to see Sigmund Rhee whenever he wanted to. Let's see, what time is it? How much time do I have, you think? Okay, all right. So he stayed on until finally the Americans felt that he'd become too close to Sigmund Rhee, and they came for him. They came for him in the middle of the night and put him in a straitjacket. It was decided at some level in the U.S. Air Force that he was mentally ill, suffering from schizophrenia. That was the diagnosis that was given by Air Force psychiatrists, and that I found in his military service record. But he had had no history in his military service record, or to know, from conversations with people who'd served with him and lived with him for years, of mental illness. He was not mentally ill. He was mentally ill in the declaration of the U.S. Air Force. He had been, his boss had him sacked. He'd called him an invaluable man in 1956. In 1957, he sacked him. Nicholls was sent to a psych ward in Japan, where he got really, really angry because he didn't know what the hell was happening to him. He ran outside in his pajamas. Finally, they immobilized him with Thorazine. Then they put him on another airplane and flew him to Eglin Air Force Base in the Florida Panhandle, where he was given electroshock. Now, that's not Donald Nicholls. That's Jack Nicholls from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. But that's a fairly accurate depiction of what they did to him over several months. He told his family that they were trying to destroy his memory. What they did destroy was his credibility, and they destroyed his career. And he was told to either retire on a military disability or he'd be thrown out. So he left the Air Force in 1958. The last chapter of his life is a story of crime, pedophilia, writing a fantastically unreliable biography. But he also had one final trip to South Korea. They brought him home in 1987 as a hero, and there was their television clips. He was in all the big papers in Seoul. It was really an incredible sort of rehabilitation for him. Then he came back to South Florida, and 2 weeks later, he was arrested for pedophilia. And this was the arrest that really stuck. This was the third real charge in his life, but this one stuck, and he got involved in the court system and ended up back in psychiatric care, where he died in 1992. And the final act of his life was to fake his tombstone. Kim Hwa, the woman whose name is on the tombstone, he said that she was his wife, but Donald Nicholls was a homosexual who never was known to have had a relationship with any woman outside of his family. The woman who is supposedly buried in that tomb died in 1953, if she existed at all, and the box is empty. But it gave a sort of nice cast to eternity that he was a conventional man. He also reunited his parents at that burial plot. Just in the tombstone behind, his wife, his mother Myra, and his father Walter are together in death, even though she died in Delray, Florida, and he was buried in New Jersey. In the Donald Nicholls fantasy world, they're together next to him and his non-existent wife. He also did not mention on the headstone that he'd ever served in the Air Force, that he became a major, and he also forgot the Korean War. Thank you.